Thank you for those kind words and the commercial plug, as it were. In fact, my paper starts with J. Lloyd, who in September 1894, he was then registrar and lecturer in Welsh history at the University College of North Wales in Bangor, delivered an address at the opening of the academic year on the subject of early Welsh agriculture. As its printed text runs to a mere 11 pages, this is clearly an extremely poor relation to Fergus Kelly's major volume on early Irish farming. However, both works have one thing in common: a reliance on legal texts. Lloyd's lecture focused on the Middle Ages and drew mainly on the evidence of the Welsh law books as published in Aneurin Owen's edition of 1841. The only secondary work cited was Frederick Seebohm's English Village Community of 1883. Beginning with an account of land tenure, Lloyd moved on to explain what the laws revealed of farm buildings, agricultural implements, and farming methods, including arrangements for ploughing and the kinds of crops grown. A few years later, in 1898, Lloyd embarked on a much more wide-ranging study, namely a book on the ancient Welsh laws, for which he considered three possible titles: Old Welsh Institutions, Society and Law in Medieval Wales, or Early Welsh Law and Society. It was to be an ambitious work, conceived in 5 parts, dealing respectively with the sources, mainly the legal texts, the tribe, the king, the church, and sketch of the historical development of Welsh law. If it had come to fruition, the volume might well have been commensurate in its scope and scale with Fergus's earlier major volume, A Guide to Early Irish Law. However, to judge by his surviving papers in Bangor, Lloyd got no further than writing the introduction and the first chapter. Instead, his most extensive use of the laws came in his magnum opus, A History of Wales from the Earliest Times to the Edwardian Conquest, first published in 1911, notably in a chapter on early Welsh institutions. I should have said at the beginning that the handout merely summarises some of the works and some of the names I'll be mentioning in the order they come. It's very elementary. Lloyd's use of the medieval Welsh laws may be situated in what might be termed a Whiggish narrative of their reception in the 19th century. Put very simply, this was a tale of progress, in which first the laws were made more accessible and comprehensible through the appearance of Aneurin Owen's edition and translation in 1841. And second, the texts were then used by scholars interested in the comparative study of early societies, of whom Seebohm was a notable example. These developments in scholarship are clearly important and will be considered further in the first part of the present discussion. However, the 19th century reception of Welsh law was not restricted to scholars. Consequently, I will also look at attempts to rely on the laws in the context of the English common law of the Victorian period, as well as, lastly, at popular perceptions of Hywel Dda and his laws, which will draw in part on the evidence of newspaper reports. The history of the publication and study of the Welsh laws is admirably covered in a survey published just over 50 years ago by Hywel Emanuel. As far as the 19th century is concerned, the law texts were made more accessible in 3 main phases. First, the 3rd volume, published in 1807, of the ambitious compendium of medieval Welsh literature entitled The Myvyrian Archaeology of Wales, included a transcript by William Owen Pugh of a 13th century manuscript of the North Welsh Iorwerth redaction, then held by the Welsh School in London, now British Library Additional Manuscript 14931. Huw had already published a 14th century text with English translation of the Southern Cyfnerth redaction in the Cambrian Register in 1795-6. The law text in the Myvyrian Archaeology, an anthology which remained influential throughout the 19th century, being reissued in a revised edition in 1870, provided an alternative to that of the first printed edition of the laws, Wotton and Williams's Leges Wallicae of 1730, whose base text was another 13th century Iorwerth manuscript, B.L. Cotton Titus D2, known by the siglum B, together with a Latin translation. The second stage followed when Huw's text was made accessible to a wider audience in 1823, when an English translation of it was published by the Unitarian minister, antiquary, and biblical scholar William Probert in his Ancient Laws of Cambria. Finally, thirdly, in 1841, as already mentioned, Huw's son, Aneurin Owen, building on his father's work on the laws, published his Ancient Laws and Institutes of Wales in the government's Record Commission series, for which Owen was responsible for works pertaining to Welsh history. The appearance of Owen's edition thus witnessed to two complementary strands in scholarship in the earlier 19th century, namely the efforts of particularly London-based Welsh antiquarians like Huw, and official initiatives to publish sources from medieval Britain. Benjamin Thorpe's Ancient Laws and Institutes of England had appeared in the same series the year before Owen's magnum opus. As is well known, Owen opened a new chapter in the textual study of the laws, principally through his distinguishing of three main vernacular versions or redactions, which have already been mentioned earlier today, which in turn he separated from material he dubbed anomalous laws, which were largely extant in later medieval manuscripts. The Welsh texts were also all provided with facing English translations. Thereafter, as Howell Emanuel pointed out, textual study of the laws only resumed in earnest with A.W. Wade Evans's volume Welsh Medieval Law in 1909. The debt of Owen to the patriotic scholarship of his father and fellow editors of the Myvyrian Archaeology had its downside, however. For that anthology had included a fair amount of spurious material concocted by the fertile imagination of Edward Williams, better known as Iolo Morgannwg. This included the legal triads attributed to Dyfnwal Moelmud, the legendary British king and legislator, triads which Owen reprinted from the Myvyrian Archaeology with a translation as Book 13 of his Ancient Laws. In fairness, Owen did not claim that Dyfnwal was the author of these triads, and indeed acknowledged that, to quote, their antiquity is very dubious, belonging in their extant form to the 16th century. Nevertheless, he held that, to quote again, as explanatory of many obscure passages in the laws, they are of the greatest importance. His father had passed no comment on the triad's authenticity in his brief introduction to the third volume of the Myvyrian Archaeology, but, as we shall see, the attribution to Dyfnwal was sufficient for some writers to seize upon them as evidence of a pristine British or Welsh law that Howell subsequently changed for the worse. Familiarity with Hywel Dda and his laws was sustained throughout the 19th century in Welsh histories and biographical dictionaries. Following the lead of the earliest histories of Wales in the Elizabethan period, new editions of which were produced as late as 1832, assessments of Howell's rule were mostly very favourable and linked his legal codification to the peacefulness of his reign as well as to his piety. As David Peter put it in 1816 in his Welsh language History of Religion in Wales, Hywel was a peaceful man who codified the laws which had almost lost their vigour owing to the disturbances of the times. And on account of his wisdom, Peter went on, his justice and his gentleness, he was called Huw the Good. Likewise, J.H. Parry, in his biographies of famous Welsh individuals entitled The Cambrian Plutarch, published in 1824, praised Hywel as, to quote, the Welsh Justinian, patriotic, of a pious and devout disposition, a man who stood out, to quote again, in solitary preeminence among the crowd of monarchs with whom he is intermixed, namely the warlike adventurers or predatory chieftains who dominated the history of Wales for centuries. The main dissenting voice to such golden opinions was that of the Reverend Peter Roberts, an Anglican clergyman from Denbighshire and graduate of Trinity College, Dublin. In a discussion of Dyfnwal Moelmead in 1811, Roberts asserted that Hywel did not deserve his epithet, Dda, the Good, as he had intruded oppressive monarchical authority into what had previously been the law of the people or nation, citing as his evidence for the latter the legal triads attributed to Dyfnwal, recently published in the Myvyrian Archaeology. Roberts also denied that Hywel had taken the laws to Rome, as was claimed in some of the later prologues to the law books, for approval by the Pope, claiming that all that was a Roman Catholic interpolation. Though they excited disagreement from some Welsh historians, Roberts's views were reported sympathetically in the entry on Hywel in the 10-volume Welsh language encyclopedia Y Gwyddoniadur Cymreig, published later in the century. Nor were such critical views restricted to Roberts. Thus, over a decade later, William Probert, in the introduction to his translations of the laws I've mentioned already, while praising Hywel, felt that his legal compilation marked a decline. To quote, the triads of Dyfnwal Moelmead breathe a spirit of liberty and dignity truly honourable, but in Hywel's code we perceive a falling off of that noble spirit, occasioned no doubt by the introduction of foreign manners and the spreading influence of Gothic barbarity and fanaticism. From a more critical perspective, the barrister John Jones, armed with a doctorate from the University of Jena, while praising Hywel in his 1824 History of Wales as, to quote, the only good prince that Wales ever produced and an eminent statesman of Cambria, concluded that his law code was a very poor production, remarking dismissively that its opening section on the royal court might suit the establishment of a farmer in the present day. Jones drew his examples of the laws from Wotton and Williams's edition of 1730, which had a Latin translation. A much fuller English summary of the laws in the same edition had already been provided by the Reverend William Warrington in his History of Wales, first published in 1786. Sorry, there's an error on the handout where I've given the date of the third edition, which I happened to buy early in the year, so it's fixed in my mind. Anyway, this reached its fourth edition in 1823, the year before Jones's work appeared. Warrington's emphasis on Welsh history as a struggle for liberty won approval from Welsh patriotic circles in London, with which he became sufficiently connected for William Owen Pugh to give help with the orthography of Welsh words, as well as to draw a map of Wales for the second and subsequent editions of the history. The stress on liberty also presumably accorded with the Whig principles of William Ponsonby, 2nd Earl of Bessborough, whom Warrington served as chaplain. Warrington was also more sympathetic than Jones in his assessment of the laws, albeit from a stadialist perspective, deeming them, to quote, a tolerable advance in juridical policy for that age. Moreover, he praised Hywel for his legal achievement, observing that his code of laws is the best eulogium to his memory and raises him as much above the rest of the Cambrian princes. A more nuanced assessment of Hywel and his laws appeared in the Hanes Cymru, History of Wales, by the Reverend Thomas Pryce, otherwise known by his bardic name Carn Hianawg, published in instalments between 1836 and 1842. Thus, Pryce questioned whether Hywel's reign was in fact as peaceable as it appeared from the medieval chronicles, observing that their coverage of events may have been incomplete. And he also accepted that there must have been accretions to the king's original code in the surviving manuscripts. Pryce's account of the laws predated the appearance of Aneurin Owen's edition and relied on the text of the Iorwerth redaction published in the Myvyrian Archaeology. However, Owen's ancient laws soon left its mark on historical writing. Thus, B.B. Woodward, in his History of Wales of 1853, praised Owen's editorial work as to, quote, a noble monument of the reverence for law and the love of order and completeness which have characterized the natives of the Principality. And he provided a reasonably full summary, including condemnation of the morality of the laws on marriage, that emphasized the difficulty of identifying Hywel's contribution and concluded with a call for further critical work on the texts and comparison with other early laws. 2 decades later, Gweirydd ap Rhys, editor and principal author of Hanes y Britanniaid a'r Cymru, the history of the Britons and the Welsh, provided an even fuller summary of the laws based on Owen and insisted on the need to look at them in their entirety in order to make a fair assessment, rather than simply picking on to translate the most unrefined and worthless things in them, as some English historians of Wales had done, a barb clearly aimed at Woodward. The appearance of the editions and translations of Wotton and Williams, Probert and Owen also helped to attract interest in medieval Welsh law from writers on the continent. For these, the laws provided a unique, even exotic, comparative perspective on early European law and society. More specifically, in the early 19th century, several Francophone authors believed that the Welsh legal texts were relevant to the early history of Brittany, or indeed Gaul more generally. This is shown, for example, at the end of the 18th century by Jacques Cambry's inclusion of a brief extract from the laws in his Voyage dans le Finistère, and the summarizing of material translated by Probert in the Bibliothèque Universelle de Genève in 1825. These were followed in 1832 by a fuller and more analytical study by Gabriel Pignot, a prolific author, bibliographer, and member of the Académie Celtique, in a short work whose title, the title in French is on the handout, may be translated as A Depiction of the Customs of the 10th Century, or the Court and Laws of Hywel the Good, King of Aberfraw, 907 to 948. Pignot followed Cambry in arguing that the laws not only threw light on Hywel's kingdom, but also by inference on other small polities in Britain and Gaul at the same period. A key point here was to highlight the contrast between medieval custom and more advanced modern law, which Pignot did by summarising various aspects of the Welsh laws, including the tractate on the royal court and the laws of women. Likewise, he declared that the barbarity of the times was shown by a rule cited in Latin by him because he explained its content made it impossible to render it in French, namely the rule on rape, whereby the accuser brought her testimony against the alleged perpetrator by holding a relic in her right hand and the accused's male member in her left. This, taken together with the rules allowing divorce, made it difficult to believe, so Pignot maintained, that Hywel could really have obtained the Pope's approval for his codification. However, this fuller study of the laws by a continental scholar in the 19th century was undertaken by the German legal historian Ferdinand Walter, whose volume Das Alte Wales, published in 1859, marked the culmination of an interest that had started in the 1820s and provided the subject of a Latin lecture at the University of Bonn to mark the 67th birthday of Frederick William III of Prussia in 1837. In this case, too, it seems that the appeal of Welsh law lay in its exotic quality, as something that cast a unique light on early European law. And Voltaire went to some trouble to consult a range of literary and historical sources, as well as editions of the law texts themselves, including Aneurin Owen's, in order to delineate both legal principles and the light these shed on medieval Welsh society. Later in the century, his approach was followed by Friedrich Engels in a brief discussion of the Welsh laws relating to kinship and marriage in his work The Origin of the Family, Private Property and the State, which drew in turn on the work of the American anthropologist Lewis Henry Morgan. Likewise, W.F. Skene cited Welsh law as providing comparisons that could help to elucidate tribal organisation in early Scotland. And as mentioned at the beginning, Frederick Seabohm also approached the laws from a comparative perspective as evidence that could illuminate the development of early societies, and thus whose relevance was by no means restricted to medieval Wales. F.W. Maitland was another late 19th century scholar who emphasised the significance of the Welsh law texts for the legal historian. The publication of Aneurin Owen's edition in turn helped to facilitate efforts to give new life to medieval Welsh law within the framework of the 19th century common law. I've examined these in detail in an article written with Gwilym Owen that will shortly appear in the Journal of Legal History, and therefore will only summarise the main conclusions here. It should be stressed that the appeal to Welsh law occurred in the very specific context of disputes over foreshore rights in the mid-Victorian period, and that the arguments turned on accommodating medieval Welsh law in, rather than presenting it as an alternative to, the common law. In brief, 3 landowners in North Wales sought to demonstrate that their right to foreshores had been established under Welsh law, and in 2 cases cited specific legal rules to support their case. This was all in response to attempts to claim the foreshores as the property of the Crown. The 2 earliest cases occurred in the 1850s with respect to foreshores under the Dee estuary in Flintshire and the Cole beneath them. Among the evidence assembled on behalf of Lord Mostyn was a passage from the Venedosian Code, the Iorwerth redaction as we now call it, in Owen's edition. That is a text originally composed in 13th century Gwynedd. In addition, a dissertation on the case by an author strongly supportive of Mostyn cited the passage in full to quote as showing what was the ancient common law of Wales and as evidencing that the manors in Wales in their integral character included the seashore as a parcel of the fee. This was later followed by the assertion that by the ancient law of Wales, the Crown has no more than a limited right to the shore. The second Flintshire landowner, Sir John Hanmer, placed greater emphasis on Welsh law in the detailed evidence he assembled concerning the medieval lordship of Englefield, in which the disputed foreshore along the Dee estuary was located. It's true that no specific text of the laws was mentioned, let alone cited, but the claim made was consistent with the rule in the Venedosian Code and could therefore have been based upon it. Be that as it may, the general thrust of Hanmer's argument regarding the status of medieval Englefield, whilst Tig Ingle, was accepted by the Crown's law officers, who in July 1855 amended the original information against Hanmer so that it was restricted to the construction of a grant by King Charles I. Although there was no explicit mention of Welsh law in the arguments for abandoning the part of the information asserting that the lordship of Englefield, still vested in the Crown, did not extend beyond high water mark, it may have been implicit in the acknowledgement that the lordship included the foreshore under Welsh rule prior to its consequent conquest by the Normans. To quote, before the conquest by Huw Pryce, Earl of Chester, or more accurately, by his nephew and subfeudatory Robert of Rhuddlan, that is in the late 11th century, this district, Englefield, was part of Wales. And I think there can be little question that if the point had been mooted, no one would have doubted that in his hands the seashore was part of the territory conquered by him and was part of his land of Englefield. The most notable and well-publicised attempt to cite the laws of Hywel Dda in defence of foreshore rights occurred, however, with respect to the foreshore of the manor of Cemais in northeast Anglesey. And like the Flintshire examples, this case, Attorney General versus Jones, went to trial twice, and the two trials in 1862 were widely reported in the press. As with Mostyn, the Defence Counsel cited the rule from the Venedosian Code, but took the argument further in a way that was not applicable to Flintshire in the northeast, by arguing that Henry VIII's Acts of Union had allowed those elements of Welsh law approved by Edward I after the conquest of 1282-4 to continue in the three northwestern counties, including Anglesey, also Carnarvonshire and Meirionnydd. In other words, the defence argued that the rule in Welsh law had not been superseded by English law, but had been recognised by it. It's true that the appeal to Welsh law proved inconclusive, and the defendant, in reality the lord of the manor of Cemais, William Buckley Hughes, a prominent Anglesey landowner and political figure in North Wales, that he won the case on other grounds. What's striking, though, is that despite the best efforts of the Crown's Counsel, the judge at the second trial in 1862 refused to rule that the introduction of Welsh law in the case was intrinsically inadmissible. His objection, rather, was that it could not be proved that the particular Welsh law text cited by the defence had been approved by Edward I and thus allowed to continue under the Acts of Union. Moreover, the judge stated that he had been involved in a previous trial in which one version of the Welsh laws supported the prosecution while another supported the defendant. As a footnote to this, I should add that, as Liam Branagh has kindly pointed out to me, there's an interesting parallel here in a case in the Irish Free State, which may be familiar to many of you, analysed by Thomas Moore. This concerned fishing rights in the tidal portion of the River Erne in Donegal, and resembles the Welsh foreshore cases in featuring the citation of early Irish legal texts from a government-sponsored edition, supported by evidence provided by scholars expert in early Irish law and history, in this case Owen MacNeill and Daniel Binchy, as well as debate about how long those laws had remained in force in the area of Ireland affected and what this implied about the validity of early modern grants. Finally, coming back to 19th century Wales, it's worth stressing that an awareness of Hywel and his laws was by no means restricted to scholars, antiquaries and lawyers, but extended far more broadly in Welsh society. For example, in the early decades of the 19th century, the laws of Hywel Dda were seen as favouring the poor and those oppressed by the English common law, and may have been held to justify the practice of building a shack in one night, the custom known in Welsh as building a tŷ unos, in the belief that that created a freehold. Also attributed to the laws was the retributive justice involving the ritual use of the ceffyl pren, literally wooden horse, in which an alleged offender was paraded around a village in person or effigy on a wooden pole or ladder. Thus, one observer claimed that the ceffyl pren was, to quote, derived from the Old Welsh law, abolished by the introduction of the English law in the latter part of the reign of King Henry VIII. And the same writer complained, in addition, to quote again, in the best of times, it is difficult to make a Welshman speak the truth, either with or without an oath, no doubt attributable to the curious provisions of the old Welsh laws, traditionary reminiscences of which still remain. More generally, Hywel Dda belonged to the gallery of medieval Welsh rulers whose memory was cherished in 19th-century Wales as a source of patriotic pride. His reign formed the subject of Eisteddfod competitions, his name was used as a nom de plume by literary competitors, and his laws were cited as evidence for the antiquity of Welsh poetry and music. Such was his renown that he could turn up in unexpected company. Thus, a newspaper report of the death in 1861 of Cavour, the first Prime Minister of the Italian Kingdom, he played a key role in uniting, declared, I translate, "The world never nurtured a more able politician than Cavour, who stands equal to Dyfnwal Moelmud, Alfred the Great, Hywel Dda, Cromwell, and Palmerston." Mixed bunch. 2 years later, Hywel was invoked in another contemporary context, this time affecting Wales directly, namely the plan to establish a Welsh settlement in Patagonia in the south of Argentina. The newspaper Seren Cymru thought the would-be settlers should stay at home rather than venture to such an inhospitable environment inhabited by savage men and rapacious beasts, in order to establish, I translate, a kind of small kingdom where the laws of Hywel Dda and Dyfnwal Moelmud are followed, and the Welsh language is spoken from the king on his throne down through the law courts to the cobbler at his workbench. Further evidence of the high respect for Hywel Dda in 19th-century Wales is furnished by the naming of lodges after him by two Welsh friendly societies, mutual benefit societies with a strong social and cultural dimension. This reflected the patriotic objectives of both the Ordyddion, or Oddfellows, founded in 1829, and the Philanthropic Order of True Ivorites, initially restricted to Welsh speakers and dedicated to preserving the Welsh language, founded in 1836. Thus, in 1863, a true Ivorite from Mountain Ash urged his fellow members across Wales to strive for national unity in a manner, to translate, worthy of the successors of Taliesin, Hywel Dda, Catwg, and Ifor Hael. The writer claimed that the society had about 15,000 members, and the study of Glamorgan has shown that friendly societies did indeed recruit a substantial part of the population, especially the male population, as its members, many of whom belonged to the labouring classes. The Hywel Dda lodges thus point to a widespread awareness of the 10th century king and quite possibly his role as legislator, especially in the rapidly growing industrial communities of South Wales. Hywel and his laws were also invoked more explicitly for patriotic purposes. One common theme, whose origins lay in Elizabethan historical writing, but which was elaborated in the 19th century as a way of asserting Wales's special contribution to an imperial Britain, was the claim that Welsh law had provided the foundations for English common law. Building on David Powell's assertion in his History of Cambria of 1584 that King Alfred had translated the British laws of Dyfnwal Moelmud, J.H. Parry maintained both that those laws had been taken to Wessex by Alfred's biographer Asser of St. David's, and that they had influenced English common law. By the middle of the century, this view was sufficiently popular to provoke B.B. Woodward into rejecting it at some length in his History of Wales, though this did not stop R.J. Derfel shortly afterwards from attributing Alfred's introduction of trial by jury to Dyfnwal's laws. Nor was that the end of the story. For a generation later, around 1889, the anonymous author of a Welsh language pamphlet confidently declared, without feeling the need to cite any evidence in his support, about one thing everyone agrees, both the English and those overseas, as well as the Welsh, namely that the laws of Hywel Dda show remarkable wisdom, perfect originality, without any borrowing from any other nation, and that they are in truth the foundation stones of the laws of Great Britain at this moment. Such wishful thinking may seem a world away from the endeavours of Seabohm, Skene and Maitland. Yet the anonymous pamphleteer shared one point in common with his scholarly contemporaries, namely a conviction that the significance of medieval Welsh law was not confined to Wales and could shed light on wider legal and social developments. Moreover, the patriotic sentiments expressed in the pamphlet reflected a significant strand of opinion respecting Hywel and his laws in 19th-century Wales that merits attention alongside the editing and analysis of the legal texts to which we remain indebted today. In short, the reception of medieval Welsh law was multifaceted and served a variety of uses, both within and beyond the lands once subject to Hywel Dda. Thank you.